Welcome to another video retrospective for Way Back Wednesday. This time we're going to look at a very old basketball game that's actually been in the news recently, Double Dribble, developed by Konami in 1986 and ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1987. So you may have heard that Double Dribble was at the centre of a recent controversy involving Family Guy. I invite you to look up the full story if you're interested, but in a nutshell, in the episode Run Chris Run, the show used some footage of Double Dribble from a YouTube video by a user called Switched, with a 1, that highlighted an exploit in the game, which ultimately resulted in said video being taken down due to an automatic copyright claim on behalf of Fox. It's basically a tale of a flawed copyright system, a touch of hypocrisy, and general criticism of Family Guy's writing staff. For the record, the video has since been made available once more. But that's not what I'm actually focusing on today. I'm just taking advantage of the game being back in the public eye to do a video about it myself. That said, this is a game that I've wanted to talk about in an NLSC feature for a while now, because I remember coveting it as a kid with an NES. Back in those carefree days of the 90s, long before I was an old man of 31 talking about old basketball video games in 2016, I had a great local game store that sold new and used Nintendo and Sega games. They had a good trade-in policy where, for a nominal fee, you could trade in your games for other second-hand titles. Since not all games are of equal value, there was an established policy and guide as to which games could be swapped for one another. Outside of renting games from a video store, it was a great way to experience new games. Being a basketball fan, I was often drawn to Double Dribble when I was looking to trade in a game, as it was one of only a few Hoops games actually released for the NES. In particular, I was tempted by the cinematic dunks, which were naturally pictured on the back of the box. For some reason though, I always chose something else, and I eventually moved on to newer consoles as well as PC gaming. It wasn't until years later that I actually played Double Dribble for the first time. Even though Double Dribble is kind of considered to be a classic and deserves to be cut some slack, it was developed in 1986 after all, I'd have to say that I probably made the right choice, all things considered. Sports gaming still had a long way to go back then, and the NES, being an 8-bit system with a controller featuring only 2 face buttons, didn't exactly offer much of an opportunity to create an outstanding basketball game that would still hold up years later. In fact, the best, or at least most high-tech, representation of basketball on the NES might actually be the one-on-one minigame in The Flintstones The Rescue of Dino and Hoppy, which deserves points for not making a pun out of the fact that the basketball is often referred to as The Rock. A product involving the Flintstones that avoids blatant rock puns is no small achievement. I mean, have you seen any of the Flintstones movies co-produced by the WWE? An NBA version would surely feature Michael Jawstone and the Chicago Woolly Mammoths. But I digress. Like I said, Double Dribble seems to be at least occasionally considered a classic, and it's definitely worth mentioning when we discuss the history of basketball video games. It's obviously very primitive though, and I'm not just talking about the graphics. Again, I did have an NES growing up, so I'm hardly shocked by 8-bit graphics, or unwilling to accept them for what they are. For what it's worth, presentation elements such as synthesized speech, pre-game cutscenes, and halftime shows are actually all nice touches. As I alluded to earlier though, a 2-button controller isn't really ideal for a basketball game. In Double Dribble, the A button passes on offense and attempts to block or steal on defense depending on whether your opponent is shooting or dribbling. The B button is used to win jump balls, which are grabbed instead of tipped and occur at the beginning of each quarter, and also switches players on defense. It's virtually impossible to make a long pass, as teammates who are off screen basically don't exist, so forget about throwing a long outlet pass on the fast break. All fouls result in free throws, which are attempted with a jump shot animation. There is an on-screen indicator that serves as an aiming mechanic for free throws, which I've always liked in old basketball games. Fouls do kind of happen at random though, so you can mostly just mash the steal button while trying to overlap a ball handler as much as possible in order to play some tight defense. Most of the rebounds are also flat-footed, scooped up before they travel out of bounds. All in all, it's a straightforward and passable representation of basketball, about as good as you can expect given the technology of the era. Perhaps the most distinct feature of Double Dribble is the animated cutscenes that occur when you attempt to dunk. These are triggered by pressing the shoot button as you're driving to the hoop, and there are a couple of different slams in the game. Honestly, this was a creative way to get around the limited amount of animations in the game, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy them. Dunks can be missed, usually with the rebound going out of bounds unless you immediately retrieve it, but as in real life, they tend to be high percentage shots. As demonstrated in the video by Switched, and subsequently on Family Guy, there is an exploit where 3-pointers from the corner are virtually automatic. You do have to be careful as it's easy to step out of bounds, but once you know about it and some of the other hotspots in the game, it's pure cheese. In really old basketball games, these are the types of things you mastered, rather than actual basketball strategy. There isn't any kind of season mode, and there are only 4 teams to choose from: the New York Eagles, Chicago Ox, Boston Frogs, and Los Angeles Breakers. We're almost in super dunk shot territory here. There's no distinction between any of the players in terms of their abilities, but again, it's the early days of basketball gaming. You can also toggle the difficulty and the length of the quarters, but that's about it. So, how would I sum up Double Dribble? Well, it's solid enough for a basketball game released in 1987. I can appreciate it for what it is, and I do enjoy going back and seeing what older Hoops games brought to the table. It's not a game that I can spend a lot of time with though. I could go back and beat all the teams in NBA Jam Tournament Edition again and again, enjoying an extended retro gaming experience. With Double Dribble, a game or two once in a while is about all I can handle. Would I have liked it more as a kid? Maybe, but it was already getting on in years when I was considering picking it up. I think the lack of a season mode would have seen me get bored of it quite quickly. But you know what? In its own way, I think Double Dribble can be called a classic. It did receive a sequel on the Sega Genesis, a Game Boy port, and even a remake for iOS. However, I would suggest that it's an example of the term classic, not necessarily meaning that something is the best, nor a flawless, unsurpassable benchmark. Double Dribble is neither of those things, but basketball video games had to start somewhere, and in that respect, it did its job. Its dunking cutscenes also distinguish it among early Hoops games, and they leave a lasting impression. For a game named after a rule violation, Double Dribble is actually memorable for some positive reasons. Just don't expect to get a lot of mileage out of it these days.